If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel McLeod and Darnell Samuels.
Bro, I'm pretty excited. I think the audience is gonna give us a little bit of respect for doing what we try to say we do, which is represent both sides or represent the other side of arguments as strongly as possible.
We working hard. Yeah, for sure. So today, if you didn't read the show notes, today we have a special guest, Desmond Cole. Welcome, Desmond.
Thank you so much, Darnell and Joel, for having me. I appreciate you.
Yeah. No problem. For those of you who don't know, Desmond Cole is a Canadian journalist, activist, author, and broadcaster who lives in Toronto. And he previously was a columnist for the Toronto Star and has written for the Walrus, Nile Magazine, Torontoist, and many others. So Cole's activism has received national attention, specifically on issues of police carding, racial discrimination, and dismantling systemic racism. Cole was the subject of the 2017 CBC television documentary, The Skin We're In, and also hosted a radio show on News Talk 1010 from 2015 to 2020. His first book, The Skin We're In, is a year of Black resistance and power, was released in January 2020 and became the best-selling Canadian book that year. Look at this guy. Big things popping, little things stopping. Did we miss anything about you, Desmond? Want to give a little more background on you?
No, I think that's accurate. I think I should say that for the purposes of this discussion.
Okay.
That certainly for the purposes of this discussion, my activism has received the attention that you talked about. But I think I would equally say that about my journalism. Because sometimes when you're Black, people think that everything you do is activism because you're standing up for yourself. But, talking about carding, for example, and writing about my own experiences for Toronto Life, that was journalism because I didn't just talk about what happened to me. I sourced the history of this practice and talked about how it works more broadly. And I think that that's really important, that when people do this kind of work, that it is to be seen in the light that it's being done, which is, in this case, journalism. Just because I might include some of my own personal histories or narratives, sometimes people might say, oh, he wrote a memoir, for example. It's not a memoir. It's like a really, really deeply researched piece of journalism that includes sources from journalists around Canada and from historians and people who have been talking about racism and anti-Black discrimination for decades. So I'm proud to be both. I'm proud to be a journalist and an activist. And I think some people think that that's weird, and we can certainly talk about that today. Mm-hmm. But that's the only thing that I would add is that the work that I do might just seem to some like, oh, it's activism because it's fighting for Black people. There's journalism in service of Black people too, going all the way back to Ida B. Wells writing about lynching. People said that Ida B. Wells was an activist too. I think she was a journalist and an activist, and that it's possible to be both of those things.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you started there because on the last episode, that was sort of one of the things that was I see a tension between. So I think about on the last show, I brought up the idea of how many times do we hear stories about journalists that set out to tell one story and then just started pulling threads and eventually told a completely different story, and sometimes the story that went against what they were originally setting out to tell. And so the question I have for you is, how do you wrestle between sort of, let's call it the objective nature that people think of with journalism as in contrast with, activism that wouldn't necessarily have that sort of objective nature to the work?
Yeah, it's a really important question, Joel. So I don't believe that there is such a thing as objective journalism. I just don't think it exists, and I'm going to explain why. I think that there is such a thing as accurate journalism, journalism that is fact-based, journalism that is well researched. I think all of those things are possible for journalism. Objectivity, though, is not possible. And the reason that objectivity is not possible is because it would require the person doing the journalism to themselves be objective, to basically switch off like a light switch whatever biases they have in their mind, whatever preconceived understandings of the world that they have, whatever limited understandings of the world that they have. Because, to be objective, for example, it would really help to like understand every single thing that you research and see and write about as a reporter or as a columnist or as any kind of journalist. That is not possible. We're only doing the best that we have with the information that we personally have, with the understandings that we have, with the editorial team that we have. And when we say objective journalism, I think often what we're talking about is being fair. I believe in being fair. It's a very important part of journalism to be fair. People talk about balance. I think balance is important, but I don't think that there are two sides to every story and that you should tell both sides, as people say. There are 1,000 sides to every story. And you have to pick one as a journalist. And that is by definition a subjective practice. Just as when we turn on the news every morning, there's a story that leads. There's a story that comes second.
You watch the news?
I watch the news. I listen to the news. I'm a bit obsessed, you might say, at this point in my career. And I've always been fascinated, even from being a child, at the news. But who picks which story goes first? Who picks when a story gets 2 minutes or when it gets 10? Or when it gets 5 pages in the newspaper or when it actually doesn't get covered at all? It's not God beaming down from the sky, those choices. Those are people. Mm-hmm. And in a good newsroom, people actually sit around and they argue and they debate and they challenge each other. Well, why this and why that? All of those things are subjective. It doesn't mean that they're bad if they're subjective. I just think it's really important to be honest about what you're bringing to the table with your journalism. And so in my case, when I write about anti-Black racism and white supremacy, I am bringing the lens of a Black person who believes in my own liberation as a Black person being the reason I do this work. I don't do this work so that people can just decide and make up their own minds. I mean, they're free to do that, but I have made up my mind. Like, I am not neutral on racism. I am not neutral on discrimination. And, there's a wonderful quote by Desmond Tutu, the South African activist and archbishop. And he said, if you're neutral in a situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And so for me, when, for example, right now we have a conflict happening in British Columbia where there's a gas pipeline that's trying to be put in by a gas company, and there are people there who are trying to stop the pipeline. I don't believe that you can watch people saying our land is being destroyed, the water is being tarnished, the air is being polluted, and be neutral in that situation. And I think you kind of have to, at some point, editorialize. You can do reporting if you want to, and people can go out and just collect the facts if they want to. That's fine. But a news agency that only for 15 or 20 years just reports that and never gives its own opinion, well, what's really going on here? Why is this happening? I think that's irresponsible and limited journalism. Because you know what, guys? If a journalist outlet gives its opinion, like here's who you should vote for example, which newspapers have been doing for a long time, it doesn't mean you're forced to agree with them. It just gives you a frame of reference to make up your own mind. But they're being honest. We think this is the best choice. You don't have to agree with us to read this newspaper. You don't have to do what we tell you. We're just giving you our honest opinion based on our assessment of the facts to help you decide. And I totally believe that, but it's not objective. It is subjective.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point that, the author always is coming with their own bias or their own perspectives, and no one will ever be able to totally even put those aside. I think you made a statement about being fair, and the thought that comes to my mind is use the example that you just discussed out in BC, right? I think I saw some line regarding, let's say, a level of dispute between, let's say, the leaders of let's just say a particular tribe and the individuals talking. Is it possible to be fair while excluding some of the facts? And that's where I think the term objective being more so that representing all sides or representing all relevant sides for people to make their decision for themselves. Now, I would say to some extent what you have started getting into a little bit of like, well, I think this is the way that things should go. And so, I think about like old school, like when we were in university writing an essay, well, finishing with your arguments as to why we should do X, Y, Z, but being fair, I think sometimes can result in people saying, well, I'm just not going to include X, Y, and Z because it goes against my arguments or against my position. And I think that's where, activism sort of goes, well, I'm just going to leave out this information because it goes against my objectives.
And I'll tell you something, because you're making a really important point here. This is how bias can operate, right? Whether you're an activist or not, you can be prejudiced by what you tend to understand about the world, and it can make you leave out things, whether on purpose, because you don't want them included in the argument for people to consider, or you might not even realize that you're doing that, but you have a prejudice that's making you leave out certain kinds of information. And what I think is important is journalists have to be very, very thick-skinned and open to critique. I cannot emphasize this enough. Journalists have to be open to the critique that they may have left out something really important in a story. Not because they hate someone or because they're biased, but maybe they honestly didn't even consider it from someone else's perspective. And I think the greatest compliment that I receive from time to time as a journalist is when someone says, you helped me think about this in a way that I wasn't thinking about it before. That is a wonderful service that journalism can provide. But we as the journalist have to recognize we're not the be all and end all of fact, of analysis, of what to include and what not. So when somebody tells us, hey, you missed this really important part of this story, we need to be able to listen and hear that and to consider that going forward, because nothing grants us more access to answers or knowledge or thinking than anybody else. We're also just out here trying to do our best.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Now, the context of our conversation going forward would be about the Judge McCloud case. And now I can't remember how long ago it was, Joel, but we did an episode covering the Judge McCloud case.
January 15th of this year is when we published.
January 15th. Oh, okay. January 15th of this year. And the episode was called Black Judges Matter. And so when we released that episode, you gave us some feedback.
Yeah.
Which was unexpected, because it's not every day someone with a blue check mark on Twitter inboxes me. so I was like, oh shoot. Oh man, this guy's probably gonna come after me or whatever the case is. But you said that we did a great job, or that we showed that we put in the work to read all the articles, and actually, you know what, to be honest, Desmond, and to the listeners, after that episode, usually, Joel and I say, oh yo, that was fun. Like me and Joel were like, oh, that was a great episode, that was fun. After that episode, Joel and I said to each other, it was like, yo man, that was kind of hard. Like that was it was really, there's so many layers. We were kind of like, man, felt like we didn't do it justice. And so you messaged me and we were kind of like, okay, well, there was things you guys missed. And we had a long conversation about the details of the case. And I offered to you to come on to the show, and you gracefully declined because you didn't want to compromise the case. Right?
Yeah, the hearing was still going on at that time, and I said I'd rather wait till it's over.
Yeah. So we're like, okay, cool. We'll wait till it's over. And I forgot about that conversation. I forgot about the case, and so I follow Jamel Giovanni on Twitter, right? and Jamil posted, this was a post November 8th. And he said, "Welcome to 2020. Toronto Star, but hey, at least you're catching up. Can't say the same for most news media in Canada." And so there was an article by the Toronto Star by Royson James, and it said, "The divisive activism of Desmond Cole, how a campaign against a black judge shattered Toronto's black community." And this is another, so that was recent, but then Jamil also tagged, or he had an image in the tweet from a year ago, and it was from the National Post, and it was a piece against Jamel Giovanni. It said, "Jamel Giovanni, shameful news media overlooks authoritarianism in the anti-racism movement. The character flaws of the media's handpicked activists and academics have been revealed for all to see." And so he was just kind of bringing that up. And when I saw your name pop up in the article, I was just like, "Oh yeah, Desmond, I forgot." And so I was like, okay, you know what? Right, I totally forgot about this guy. So I was like, okay, you know what? I looked up the article, and it was blocked because it was behind a paywall. And so I had to pay $4 to find out what was really going on. And side note, Toronto Star won't let me out of the deal. And so I'm arguing with them. I'm arguing. I can't get my money back right now. So Toronto Star's acting real sketchy. I called them twice. They said they get a supervisor back to me, but we're gonna escalate this. All right, back to the show. All right, back to the show. Right. So I was like, okay, I read the article, and yeah, it was definitely they definitely came for your head, Desmond. So I was like, okay, you know what? The case is settled. And I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to talk about the case and the nuances that Joel and I may have missed, or even the people don't know about the case. So can you give like just an overview of the case for those people who don't know, or even Joel missed?
Yeah, I'll do my best, and then I want to come back to Jamil and Royson. We'll get to those guys who have had those criticisms that you mentioned. But first, okay, I'll try to sum this up as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. In 2017, there was something called the National Black Canadians Summit. I actually write about it in my book. This is a gathering hosted by the Michael Jean Foundation. Hundreds of Black people came. It was in Toronto at the Reference Library. And at that gathering, we were all introduced to a new group that said it was going to be the new advocacy group for Black Canadians. And it called itself the Federation of Black Canadians. So they were acting as though they were kind of like the co-hosts or the big feature of this conference in 2017. And the first thing that happened was that their leader, their founder and chairperson, introduced himself and the group to everybody, the hundreds of people at that gathering. And that founder and spokesperson and chairperson is named Donald McLeod, and he is a judge in the Ontario court. I was sitting in the audience when this happened, and I was kind of like looking around, like, am I in the Twilight Zone right now? Like, what is going on? And the reason it felt so strange to me was that judges, by definition, are not allowed to engage in political advocacy. And yet, here is a judge standing here telling us that he has actually started his own political advocacy group. Now, to be clear, that's not the same as saying, like, well, I want to do community work. So Justice McCloud also has a charity that he started called 100 Strong, where he mentors young boys, Black boys in his community. That's not the same thing as saying Black people have political needs that the government is not listening to, and I am going to be part of the solution in fighting and advocating for political changes. Why is that a problem? Why should anybody have a problem with that? Well, it's really simple. If you ever take like a basic civics course, the first thing that you're going to learn about, or one of the first things, is the division of powers in Canada. And we have a judicial branch of government, which is judges like Justice McCloud. We have a legislative branch of government, which in the case of the federal government is Parliament, or in the provincial government is the Ontario legislature, for example. And we have the executive, which is the head of government at the time. So Doug Ford is the premier of Ontario. Justin Trudeau is the executive leader of the federal government in Canada because he's the prime minister and he has a prime minister's office. And when you learn about civics, what you learn is that those branches of government are supposed to be separate from one another in certain ways. That if you are a judge, you have tremendous influence in the judicial branch already. You get to decide if people have freedom or not in a court case. You get to decide if people will be separated from their family, sent to jail, and have their freedoms taken away from them. And because you already have that tremendous power to interpret the laws of Canada, you don't get to influence the making of the laws of Canada at the same time as you get to interpret them. So judges don't do political advocacy because they already have a tremendous say on the law on the interpretation side. I thought this was weird that this judge now is presenting himself as political advocate. Not just me, though. Lots of people thought it was weird. And after a while, many articles were written about it. Lots of people were speaking up saying, I don't understand this. And by the way, it's not as though our Black community is like lacking of people who are completely capable of doing that work. So presenting it as this really high profile Black judge is going to do it because no one else is doing it for our community, I felt was like kind of insulting, actually. Like, we've got to have all the power consolidated into this one guy because no one else in our community is qualified to do anything. Like, that was the message. And whether it was intentionally the message or not, that's certainly how it came across to me and many other people. So what happened? The judge was found by his judicial council to have been engaging in the exact kind of political advocacy that you're not allowed to do. He was found to have been lobbying the government. He met with Justin Trudeau, with Gerald Butts, his chief of staff at the time, with Kathleen Wynne, who was premier at the time in Ontario, and with a whole bunch of federal Liberal cabinet ministers. And he didn't just meet with them. He had a whole series of proposals for funding and for government changes that he wanted. So he was doing the exact thing that I just said you're supposed to have a division of, not telling the legislative branch, here's how you legislate, here's how you make changes. That's not supposed to be a judge's job. Now, people might wonder, well, why do you care about that, Desmond? Why can't he just do whatever else? First of all, I'm a journalist, so like, this is my job. I'm supposed to report on things like this, especially because I do care about the prospect of advocacy in our community. But yes, Justice McCloud went to a hearing in 2018. They said, you're lobbying. Lobbying is not compatible with your office, so please stop doing that. We're not going to find you guilty of misconduct, but you are lobbying and that can't happen anymore. Unfortunately for Justice McCloud, though, after that first ruling in 2018, he went back to engaging in the same kinds of activities. He went to a 2019 funding meeting, where the government said we have $25 million to distribute to the Black community. Justice McCloud was there on behalf of the FBC. Like, he took a plane, or however he traveled. I don't know how maybe he took a train. I don't know, but he went to Gatineau, Quebec from Toronto, from Brampton, to be like, let me talk about that $25 million on behalf of my Federation of Black Canadians. Like, he knew he wasn't supposed to be doing things like that, and he continued. He also, unfortunately, did a couple of other things, which I reported on. And,
what were those things? What were those two things?
He started calling people in the community whose advocacy he didn't agree with. So when people were being critical of his advocacy, in the case of myself and some other people who were working on a really big deportation case at the time, and we were saying, look how this federal advocacy group does not say anything about this deportation case. Could it be that having a leader as a judge who is not supposed to do anything involving other courts was like really going to limit you talking about this federal court case of somebody being deported? I wonder, could that be a conflict? Obviously, it's a conflict. So this is why judges don't put themselves at the head of advocacy groups, because then when we really need some advocacy, you're like, oh, I can't. I'm sorry. My hands are tied by my, job. he called a member of the advocacy team for that young man, Abdul Abdi, who was set to be deported. And he was mad that we were criticizing him and kind of criticizing the limits of his advocacy. He actually promised that he was going to do things to help Abdul. He never did those things, but he literally called someone up on the phone and said, hey, stop criticizing me so much. I'll help Abdul if you want me to. And he just did that to stop personal criticisms of him. And if you're an advocate, you have to accept. I get criticized in the public all the time. We're about to talk about a 2-page spread in Toronto Star about me. Like, that's life. But you can't start using your privilege as a judge to call people and start being like, you shouldn't be criticizing me. He did it again in 2019. After being told to stop lobbying, Justice McCloud brought people to Parliament Hill in February of 2019 for an event that was called Lobby Day. Like, you can't make this up. And at that event, a whole bunch of people got racially profiled by a security guard. The security guard said some racist things to the Black people who were gathered, and obviously that made a lot of people angry. 2 of the people who were racially profiled started doing media and being like, this is awful, this is racism, we deserve an apology, and so forth. And because Justice McCloud was the one who invited them to his lobby day, and now they were speaking out in a way that was kind of embarrassing, he called them on the phone as well. And he told them, you guys need to stop being so loud. You need to stop doing this media. And if you don't stop, the parliamentary committee that's investigating this might actually decide to investigate you. That's quite a thing for somebody who's a judge to call people up and tell them. But these are the kind of things that I felt important to report on, not because they are necessarily judicial misconduct, but because as an activist myself, I just think that that's a horrible way to say that you're doing advocacy, to use your status as a judge so that when people disagree with you, you call them up on the phone and say, stop doing that or you're going to get in trouble by the state. That is so intimidating and inappropriate. And it's also a violation of your code of ethics as a judge. And I reported on those things. There was a second hearing this year, and they found that calling those 2 people on the phone was incompatible with judicial office. They found that going to that meeting about federal funding for $25 million in Gatineau was incompatible with judicial office. But they said, despite all those things, we're going to give you yet another chance. Just stop doing all of these things. Please stop. And that's been where all of the criticism has come against me, because I continued to report on this judge who continued to behave in some really questionable ways. And I guess people who support him think that because he's Black and I'm Black, that I'm some kind of traitor. Not that he has a responsibility, but the responsibility is all on me, interestingly, to not tell everyone what he was up to, even though he kept doing it. And you can imagine how I feel about that.
Just to sort of summarize, if I make sure I understand, the audience understands, essentially the reviews that happened, he, let's say, got a slap on the wrist, but wasn't deemed to sort of be unbecoming of his position.
That's right. So what they say is that there are things that you can do that are compatible with your office as a judge, and then there are things that are incompatible. So they said lobbying is incompatible. Going to funding meetings is incompatible. Calling people up when you're a judge and telling them, hey, you'll be investigated if you don't get on the right side, incompatible. But the line is misconduct. So these things are incompatible with judicial office, but in order to find somebody guilty of misconduct, Joel, you have to show that what they've done has undermined the public's confidence in the judiciary. And the hearing panels in both cases said it's bad, but it's not so bad that it undermines the confidence of the public, so you're free to go. Now, that's what they decided, and that's their decision. But for me, as a Black person in community, it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in me as a person that somebody is repeatedly doing behaviors like this and is not being held to account. So if they're not going to be held to account in the court, they at least need to be held in account in the pages of publications like my own, a black focused publication called Cole's Notes that has been my baby for, 11, 12, 13 years. I've never made a dime off of Cole's Notes. I don't get paid. There's no ads on it. I do that work for our community to tell them what's going on because I think that is a form of accountability. And I'm not interested in whether or not the court thought that what Justice McCloud did was against their rules. For me, ethically, I'm like, you can't treat people in our community like that and expect not to have anybody talk about it. So that was what I did.
Now, I think the last time we did the episode, there was an understanding that he had also stepped down, at least formally, from that organization. Is that?
Yeah, this is actually quite interesting because while the first hearing was being investigated, Justice McCloud's leadership asked him to step down from the FBC. He said, I don't want to do that. I have no intention of doing that. They still need me. And then the Ontario Judicial Council came back and said, okay, if you don't step down, we might suspend you without pay. And that changed his mind. And so then Justice McCloud did resign from the Federation of Black Canadians. He came back after the first hearing decision occurred, and they gave him a different title. But, I wasn't just reporting on some, news articles that I saw. I did really deep investigative research into the organization, the Federation of Black Canadians. I talked to former staff members who had left, former volunteers who had left the group, and they all told me that this man is still making a lot of the decisions, even though he doesn't have the same chairperson title that he did before. Now, the Ontario Judicial Council didn't say don't go back to the group, but I certainly don't think that they expected him to go back and start making these kinds of phone calls to people and going to funding meetings, which is unfortunately what he decided to do.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, it's pretty clear cut, I think, from a workplace point of view. Like, your job has rules. You broke the rules of your job. You're an extremely powerful person, though. So if you'd expect to be a powerful person breaking the rules of their job and that a journalist, Black or any other color, wouldn't report on you, that's really weird. That's my work. That's my job, is to hold powerful people to account for the decisions that they make and the behaviors that they engage in. And I know that hurts a lot of people in the Black community because they think, well, we need that leadership, but not at all costs. We do need leadership, but not at the cost of letting people engage in whatever behavior they want because we think that they are indispensable, that they are too important to be held to the same standards as everybody else. That is very dangerous. And that's what I've always been worried about in my work.
Well, okay. Well, Mr. Royson James would possibly disagree. Like,
he would.
The article, the article he wrote on you was an 18-minute read, right? It was an 18-minute read, and in it, he's just addressing you and your role in this, kind of blaming you, and there was other people who also agreed with him that you were to blame for this whole thing.
Yes.
There was somebody from the Peel District School Board, Kathy McDonald, and she said, I was disgusted that it was our own people who were involved in what I consider to be a public lynching of Donald McLeod. It's the Peel District School Board trustee Kathy McDonald, who said she and others watched in despair as the virtual hearing streamed for 17 days last December and February. In the end, it boiled down to a bunch of vindictive, envious people that just hate the skin they are in, she said. Yeah, man.
She came hard, eh? Yeah, Kathy's mad at me. I know Kathy McDonald, actually. I've worked with her in the past, and sorry, I'm stepping on your question. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. Expound. I was going to expound on that.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought this particular quote up, Darnell, as the first thing from the piece, because is it really a logical conclusion and a fair and honest conclusion that if I doggedly reported on this judge that it must be because I hate myself as a black person, because that's what she's saying. These are envious, jealous people who hate the skin that they're in. So this judge represents blackness. He's more black than anybody out here. And when you criticize him, that shows that you hate yourself as a black person. That is absurd. It's actually extremely racist to say that. To say that this upper class black man who represents the institution is more of a symbol of blackness than anybody else. Like, this is the height of what black people can be, is when we make it to the bench and we can be a judge and rule over. Is that the height of blackness, that you're not allowed to criticize lest someone say you hate yourself as a black person? Like, but these are the kinds of opinions that Royson James decided to include in his hit piece. And it's a shame, because if he had a better argument to make against my work, I'm sure he would have. And if people like Kathy McDonald, who I know and have worked with before on these very issues of anti-black racism, Kathy was the subject of a really awful report at the Peel District School Board a couple of years ago. She came on my radio show. We did an extensive segment where, we talked about and we analyzed what they were doing to Kathy. Is it really the case that I hate myself as a black person when 2 years ago, Kathy and I were sitting in a studio talking about what was being done to her? I just think these aren't the arguments of people who have a real substantive gripe. They're just hurt because they like and respect this judge, but I think they like and respect him so much that they think he's untouchable. And as I said, that's very dangerous. It would be dangerous if it was me, people were treating like that. It would be dangerous if it was anybody being treated like that. And I'll add another thing. Royson quoted another person in his piece who said, many now find themselves asking, if this could happen to a judge, could this happen to me? So if a judge can be questioned for his behavior, well then, gosh, none of us are safe. I'm sorry, ain't that the reverse of how it's actually in real life? Like, if the state goes or the media goes and picks on somebody sleeping in a tent in the rain this evening, that's if it can happen to that person, it can happen to me, because that's the person who has no protection. A judge actually has tons of protection, so much so that he can be found 3 times to be engaging in actions that are incompatible with his job and keep getting more chances. There are people in jail today who made a mistake in their life, made a bad choice in their life, and nobody gives them the 2nd and 3rd and 5th and 10th chances that a judge gets. So the judge being held to account is not the crazy standard that everybody else has to be afraid of. We actually need powerful people to be held to account, rather than people like me who were just writing about what the powerful person was doing. I think they're kind of getting it backwards.
Yeah, I think this reminds me of the W.B. Du Bois talented 10th concept about how, in order for black people to do well, you got to have the most talented 10% of black people uplifted and empowered and protected.
Yep.
Would you see that? Would you say that this is what you're kind of seeing here?
I think that's exactly what's going on here, Darnell, and I think that that's a really important way to think about this, because Royson does to me, in that piece that he wrote for the Toronto Star, which is like 4,000 words, like 2 full pages of the Sunday newspaper. I have never seen Royson given that much space to write an opinion. But he goes after me so hard. They use a picture of me. They say people are calling me Judas. I hate the skin that I'm in. Yeah, oh yeah, these things are all in there, right? But so how come it's not fair to criticize McCloud because you're tearing down the community, but it's okay to do it to me? Because I'm not in this talented 10th club. I'm not one of the people who we need to protect at all costs. I'm just a throwaway journalist who thinks he's getting too big for himself and thinks he's too important. By the way, I know W.E.B. Du Bois was writing that essay about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago. But I want to point out that he said black men. He was very, very
Yeah.
specific that it was men
Yes,
who were
that's
part
right.
of the talented 10th. And I'm
That's
sorry to say that even though it's 2021, there are a lot of people who still think that it's men like Justice McCloud, straight, tall, you know, conceivably handsome Black Christian men who are
Yeah.
going to lead all the rest of us to, you know, salvation and liberation. And that leaves out a lot of people. It leaves out women. It leaves out trans and non-binary people. It leaves out queer people. It leaves out a lot of Black people who are not usually included in these conversations, and yet are like facing some of the harshest realities of being Black. Because if you're Black and you're a woman and you're queer, you're facing a different set of experiences from the powers that be than somebody like Justice McCloud or even somebody like me. And so I do think that they're kind of making gods out of a few people who have, and how do those people show how qualified that they are? They go into the same state that's hurting Black people, the same government systems that are putting us in jail, that are arresting us, that are separating us from our families through child welfare. And if you rise up in those oppressive colonial systems, that's how we know you're part of the talented 10. I am so sorry. That is not the only and most important way to influence change in the Black community. I think that idea is really old school, and it needs to be constantly challenged because that limits who gets to have a voice in our community.
So I guess you're saying that it's good for Black people to disagree, not just behind closed doors, but in public. Because, you know, we have that saying, you know, don't air out your dirty laundry because then, you know, white people can come after us.
Do you know what happens when I don't air out my dirty laundry in my apartment? My apartment starts to stink. Real something bad. You know, I don't understand that saying. How do you not air out your dirty laundry? You're going to sit around in your own friggin' stench. That's all that's going to happen if you don't air out your laundry. And by the way, that is a central part of Royson James's argument and the argument of a lot of other people who wouldn't even want me to do this podcast because, hey, the white man is listening. And in
Joel?
fact, Joel or any other person, and they're going to use our disagreements against us. So we shouldn't act like we have disagreement in public. We should just all be together. And I ask myself, do all the other racial groups have that burden as well? Or is it just Black people who are not allowed? Like, being a human being means you're allowed to have diversity within your group, so that different Black people can actually have different opinions on stuff. It is not really empowering. And I'm going to read the last line, part of the last line of Royson's piece. He says, Black people don't have the luxury of discarding tactics and approaches that don't quite meet the best advocacy standards. So in other words, Royson is saying, we're in such a low position as Black people, we have to take whatever tactics and approaches that Black people want to do. We don't have time to be critical. We don't have time to say some are better or worse than others. All we have time to do is accept whatever people put out there in our name and deal with it. And you would never ask that of another racial group, to tell them, don't think about the tactics, don't be strategic, just throw everything out there and, hey, whatever works, works. Whether it makes people silenced in your community, whether it's ethical or not, whether it's consultative or not, just do whatever. And the bad person is going to be the person who wastes time criticizing other Black people. I'm sorry. I'm glad Royson put that in his piece, because I feel like that's a summation of what he really thinks, is that Black people are in such a low space in this country that we don't have time to figure out what's the best way to go. And like, where's that going to get us? Where is it going to get us if we're not critical? No. And I'm going to say this too, because people always use this example. I don't like this. They talk about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And they say, see, those guys didn't have all the same ideas. They didn't all agree on the same things, but they found a way to kind of support each other in the different kinds of advocacy that they were doing. Dr. King and Malcolm X debated each other. They didn't just debate each other in a quiet room where only black people could hear. They went on white man's television. One of the only times they were in the same place with each other ever, because they didn't hang out a lot. But one of the only times that they hung out was to go on national television that was not owned by black people to hash out their disagreements, because they believed that that's how we grow as black people. And you know what? They were right. And Royson here he's dead wrong.
Yeah, and you could also throw in W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and they went back and forth as well in regards to where do black people go from here after slavery.
But you see how we're always naming white men with a certain level of, black men with a certain level of literacy, with a certain level of class privilege. And we're saying that like they're the great titans who are arguing with each other. What if black people in their communities who are not these guys just want to sit around and discuss and debate and disagree? Is that bad too? Or does it only matter when it's the giants and the titans that we think matter, that they have to watch themselves because white people are listening to what they say? This is a right of everybody. It's a right of everybody to be able to critique, to use their mind, to have an analysis, to read, and to match what they're seeing in the world with our history. So I just, when people are afraid of public disagreement, I'm sad, because I don't actually know how we're going to get ahead if we're not able to be honest and open about who we are, what we believe, and the different ways that we want to move forward together. Like, that's healthy.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we try to do with this show is the idea of like, straw man free or steel man or opposition, right? If somebody makes not the best argument, we want to make the better argument for them if we're going to critique it and critique, let's say, the best versions of an argument. And, on that note, just for the audience, I'll have a podcast from Canada Land that I think does a pretty good job of some of the critiques of this article. Now, based on one of the things you had said, regarding, let's say, I think you made a comment that regarding like overall the lack of weakness to the arguments against you. I don't want to call them necessarily slander, but it's a little bit of mudslinging towards you as opposed to critiquing specific things that you did. Would you say that that's a fair?
I would agree. If you go back and you read this 4,000 word, Dear Diary entry that Uncle Royson did, you'll see that he very rarely makes a claim about me. What he does when he wants to make a claim about me is he says, other people are saying this about Desmond. So other people say that Desmond lynched the judge. By the way, should we really be using the term lynching in this manner?
Nope.
That because I was critical of somebody in the black community that I am lynching them? Like, again, what are we really saying about our ability as black people to disagree? That it's akin to literally enacting like deadly violence on other black folks because we're critical of them. It's just so over the top. But every time that the writer wants to bring a criticism of me, he does it in somebody else's words. They're saying this. This person says this about Desmond. And just to top it all off, he says, I love Desmond myself, actually. Like, I actually think the guy's great. He's doing really important work. I want him to continue his work. But
and he mentions that he put you on at the Star.
Yeah. Well, I think that claims without evidence need to be substantiated. So if there's some way that Royson James wants to explain how he put me on at the Toronto Star, I would love to hear it, because I started writing for that newspaper after pitching several successful freelance pieces myself to an editor that I ended up working with in a long-term capacity. I will say this, Royson James fought for me to be full-time after I got my part-time gig at the newspaper. And I will always give him credit for that. Even when he called me to do this trash-ass interview, I told him, I appreciate that you fought when I got into that newspaper to have me be more permanent and full-time. But I don't appreciate what you're doing now. But even him saying that, like, why is he mentioning that? Why is he mentioning that he helped grease the wheels for me? Like, doesn't he feel bad because I'm like the most horrible person now to ever come into our community? Like, he must feel awful about himself. But the reason he's saying that is because back to this talented 10th idea, I'm not grateful enough to people like Royson, who are the real big people who come and help, maybe undeserving Black people like me get ahead. And I should actually be more grateful. Like, you wrote 4,000 words to say all that? Come on, man. Like, it's not worth it. And Royson also tries to suggest in this piece many times that I'm not a journalist, that he somehow helped bring me into journalism. But every criticism that he has for me is about what he calls activism. I'm sorry, but when you can write pieces that end up being, poured over by people, scrutinized by people, but all the facts about what you reported are accurate, and no one is able to attack your facts, so they start saying like he hates himself as a Black person. I stand by my journalism. It's not activism that I did against the judge. I did journalistic work that exposed a lot of things he shouldn't have been doing, but was deciding to do. And people don't have to like it. They don't even have to read it. But this idea that, that I'm somehow a traitor to my own community, or that I'm, that I'm not really doing real journalism work, I dispute that. I think the proof is in the fact that people are attacking me personally instead of just dealing with what I wrote.
Mm-hmm. So the reason I wanted to sort of confirm the mudslinging, because I felt when we did the original episode, there was an article, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there was a Maclean's article titled "Not in Mixed Company, the Tensions in Black Canadian Advocacy." And, when I was reading that, there was a level of like, I thought that there was mudslinging in that, sort of the way it was written, very like stirring up of emotions with the terminology. And so it just makes me draw a bit of a parallel with regards to the discourse, in that, you're demonstrating like, can we not, let's say, disagree civilly, as opposed to, and so I'm wondering, we could get into some other terminology that's mudslinging around when there's a dispute, let's say from different Black voices. And so I guess the question I'd have for you is, how do we, or, how does the Black community move forward in a way that creates room, that it's not just the talented 10th, but it's also, barbershop level conversations of dispute that's encouraged, and, helping navigate the nuances of many scenarios.
So let me, as you were saying, let me steel man your argument a little bit, Joel, because I think that you had some of that criticism for me too. And I'll acknowledge that, particularly in the first blog post that I wrote about the Federation of Black Canadians, I was a little snarky. I'm not gonna deny that. And I think that the reason that I took on that tone was because one of the things, for example, that I uncovered in my early reporting on the Federation was that they're very close to the Liberal government. And how close are they? Well, they had a steering committee, which Justice McCloud, the judge, put together himself, because he's the one who founded this group and brought all the people together at the beginning. One of the people that he put on the inaugural steering committee of the FBC was a woman named Ebian Farah. Ebian Farah is married to Ahmed Hussein, the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration, and Refugees. So the idea, I guess, is that she's part of an advocacy group that's going to advocate to her own husband and his government and make changes.
Just a slight conflict of interest.
Slight conflict of interest. So do you know what? That came out in the writing of how I described things like that. And it was a bit snarky, because I'm like, come on. Mm-hmm. Who's taking it seriously that these are the people who are going to save our community? By the way, we've seen that before. There's been a huge movement in the recent years, around Black liberation, the deaths of people in the United States like Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, the killings of those people, the killings of Rekia Boyd and Sandra Bland, the killings of Black people, but not just that, all of the systemic ways that Black people are disadvantaged in education, in the employment sector. And we're all learning about those things. But you know what? It's governments that are at the head of changing those things. And they don't want to change as quickly as we do. They don't want to acknowledge that their governments are doing the things to Black and Indigenous people, particularly, that they are doing.
And that's why I advocate getting the government out of the way. But we'll probably save that conversation for another time. But anyway, sorry, continue.
Not at all. But I think what's important is that, like, certainly we've seen before that what governments try to do is, well, if there's some really pushy and aggressive Black people that are trying to make us look bad so that we'll change, what if we recruited a much more civil and friendly group of Black people who will kind of say, we're working with the government, you know, and we're listening, and they're listening to us. We're not screaming out in the street like these radicals are. We actually have the ear of government because, like, one of our steering committee members is married to the guy. Like, that's not the change that I think we need, but we see over and over again throughout history that when governments don't want to do extreme changes, they kind of bring in people who will do it the way that they want to be used against the rest of the community. And so basically, I guess what I'm saying to your point is, I felt like my criticisms were tough in some cases, but they're fair. And I don't think that they discourage people from having real, open, honest conversations. People have criticisms about me all the time. People criticized Black Lives Matter Toronto because it was mostly women, mostly queer and trans people. And some people thought that that was excluding a whole other set of community people. And they said that loud and proud. There were even people, I remember after Black Lives Matter Toronto stopped the Pride Parade in 2016, there were Black people who came out and said, I'm Black, and these Black people do not speak for me, and had very harsh criticisms of BLMTO. All I can say to you is don't start being out here being a public advocate for a large group of people if you don't want to hear what their criticisms are. I've had the conversations in the barbershops with people. I also, you know, go and get my hair cut like Royson James. Like, I also eat community dinners with people. Like, again, he tried to make it seem like there's this legit group of Black people who do all these Black things. And then there are people like Desmond who just have like thousands of white Twitter followers. Now, that also erases the unbelievably important work that I've done in Indigenous solidarity in this country. I've been fighting a lot recently with Palestinian people in Toronto and the GTA who are fighting for their rights in the Toronto District School Board. It's not just Black and white. It's not just in the community or out of the community. Racial justice is a broad struggle that includes a lot of different considerations. And we're fighting for our lives here. So it's not a conversation that's going to be easy or that's always going to be, you know, gentle. But I will do what I'm doing with you guys with anybody. When people like Kathy McDonald actually said that whole he's ashamed of the skin he's in thing. She said that on Twitter like a year before she gave that same tired quote to Royson James. You know what I did? I called her on the phone and I was like, "Hey, Auntie, you want to talk? You seem real mad. Like, do you want to talk about this?" Because there's room for that too. I'm not just out here blasting my opinions on social media or on a blog. Like, I talk to Black people every single day. I take criticisms from Black people who don't agree with what I'm doing every single day.
Like Jamel Giovanni. I know
Jamel. So now let's talk about Jamel, because my goodness, Jamel has been saying what Royson's been saying for like a long time, which is why he was so happy when Royson James wrote that piece. Okay. But what I would like to know from people like Jamel and Royson and other people who have this criticism of me is, why are all of them so close to power? Jamel Giovanni works for the government of Ontario, the Ford government. The Ford brothers are two of the most publicly destructive people for the Black community that I have ever seen in politics in my life. He works for one of them. Why is that criticism about me being so horrible coming from people like him, coming from people like Royson, who works for the newspaper that I left 4 years ago, and even 4.5 years later, they're still coming after me? Why is it coming from people like Kathy McDonald, who has a school board trustee seat? All of these people have more institutional power than I have ever had in my life. So I think that people need to pay attention. There is a class divide happening here inside the Black community. And I don't represent the upper class. As much as these guys want to say I'm so powerful when I write a piece, the truth is powerful. Exposing things that people don't want to talk about is powerful. But I'm not the one with the institution behind me. That's Royson James. That's Justice McCloud. That's Kathy McDonald. And that's Jamel Giovanni taking his blood money from Doug Ford. And I will say blood money because the Ford government has taken us through a deadly pandemic doing things like suppressing the minimum wage, clawing back Ontario disability benefits and welfare benefits that affect a lot of our community. And Jamel's happy to take that guy's money while saying that people like me are getting too big and too arrogant for our own good. So people just need to pay attention to what group of Black people these folks represent, because there are Black communities, plural, in this equation. And I don't belong to these people's upper class seat at the table, Black community. I'm doing a different thing out here.
So I'll say, just for context, I think maybe Darnell leans a little bit this way as well with regards to our, let's say, lobbying comments. You know, when it comes to class divide, I think the primary class divide that I would see is those that wield political power and those that are subject to political power. Which, you know, I think there's a nuanced conversation. I generally lean more libertarian. And so I think a lot of times the anti-government solutions get lumped in with, you know, bad motives or different things. While sometimes it's more of we want the same thing. We want to, let's say, raise the lowest levels of society up higher, but the motivation or the methods of doing so are vastly different. That they get criticized as being, you know, let's say, economic class differences. Well, as I said, I'm looking at it from who wields the political power. And as I said to your comment earlier, I want to get the government out of the way because I see them as a contributing factor and perpetuating the problem as opposed to actually a means to solve the problem.
In many ways, I also want to get government out of the way, but I also want to be really clear about like what our responsibilities are to one another. Because if we're not going to have a strong government that imposes strict kind of regimes on us, we've got to have each other's backs, and we've got to figure out ways that we're going to support and take care of each other. And this is where my analysis here about what, you know, this upper crust of Black people, this is where I take an issue. So Black people are, along with Indigenous people, the most incarcerated people in this country, and those trends are going in the wrong direction. There are more Black women in jail now than there were 20 years ago, and Black women are one of the fastest growing prison populations in Canada. So what people like Giovanni and James and McCloud want us to believe is that if we put Black people at the head of these racist institutions like the judiciary and the police, that they'll stop being as racist because Black people will make different decisions. I disagree. And there's actually no evidence to prove that if you put a Black person at the head of a racist institution, that suddenly all the other people in the racist institution are like, hey, let's do whatever this Black person says. Or even that Black person is going to fight for those things. That's also a complete misconception. We had Mark Saunders as the police chief of Toronto for 5 years. Did the police get less violent towards Black people because Mark Saunders, the Black police chief, told them to do that during his tenure? Of course not. And what's more real, which we saw with Barack Obama in the United States, is there's so much more pressure on a Black leader to not seem like they're being biased and prejudiced towards their so-called own kind. And so people in those positions actually often take a really moderate approach because they don't want to be accused of being too favorable towards Black people. So when people argue that the way we're going to stop institutional jailing of Black people, institutional arrests and sentencing of Black people, institutional separating of Black people from their families through child welfare, institutionally bad outcomes in the labor market, we just need a Black labor minister. You know, we need a Black judge, or maybe 5 or 6, and then that'll change it. So what, white people and others are not capable of treating us justly? We actually have to go into these institutions ourselves and treat ourselves fairly because everyone else refuses to? Come on. The institution itself is the problem. So yeah, I would like a lot less of the judiciary. I would like a lot less of the police. I would like a lot less of the child welfare system. But I also know that when we do that, we're going to have to find ways that we have each other's backs. because we are going to need to substitute some of the harms that these systems are doing with actual ways of taking care of each other. It's not going to happen that Black people leading institutions is going to make those institutions change. And again, if that were a real thing, somebody could just point to where that has been true, where all the Black people get into the institution because everybody wants Black people now to come in and tell them what to do. And then everything changes. Show me where that has ever happened in human history. We've been fighting this for 400 years. There have been Black people who have been allowed to be the exception to the rule, who've been allowed to be serving next to the master while other Black people toiled in the field for hundreds of years. It didn't get us any closer as a community to justice.
Mm-hmm.
So the question, one of the interviews that we did in the past, someone had brought up the fact that a lot of times institutions perpetuate underlying issues. And so I'm curious your take on, unequal or disproportionate outcomes and attributing those to institutions. And the reason I say that or push in that regard is that if we incorrectly identify the cause and effect relationship, we actually can't result in change, or we can't actually have an effective solution. And one of the examples that we sort of hashed out a little bit was there was a community report or a report regarding education in I think it was the Toronto District School Board. And, Darnell had one of the questions Darnell asked was like, well, what are the successful kids doing? We're only pointing to the, the kids that are failing. And so that the reason I bring that up is to say, really doing the work to find the cause and effect relationships is something I feel like doesn't really happen. We see disproportionate outcomes and we go, okay, we need to solve the symptom, but we don't actually dig into the cause. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And just because you had referenced institutions, right? But let me use the policing example. One of the things that I've done a little bit of digging into and found is that we do over-police the poor, and that's going to disproportionately affect minorities. And again, not to say that there aren't racists, acting in the police force. Arguably, racists would be drawn to the police force. But if we control for the over-policing of poor, how would that maybe show the level of racism maybe becomes diminished?
Yes. So this now cuts into the heart of the work that I do every day. And I think about these kinds of things a lot. And I get asked these kinds of questions a lot. How much is racism influencing the outcomes that we're seeing in society? And how much of it might just be something else? How much of it is personal responsibility? How much of it is a set of factors that Black people happen to fall into, like poverty, but that are not necessarily being directed right at them? My general feeling about this is that history is our best guide. We have lots of historical information to tell us what is going on here. So, yeah, you could say that the police tend to go after poor people, and that many Black people, not all, but many are poor. We are disproportionately, certainly, poor. And so it's not that the police are racist. It's that the police go after poor people, and then that happens to entrap a lot of Black people. I can give you a couple of reasons why we know that this isn't true. The first is, like, what were the police created to do in the first place? Like, what is the role of modern policing and where did it come from? I mentioned Fairy Creek earlier, and we're seeing people where there is a blockade of Coastal GasLink, the company, who want to build a natural gas pipeline in Wet'suwet'en territory, the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And there is division within that nation. Some people are for the pipeline, some people are against it. But what are called the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en are mainly saying, we don't want this project. So you have the RCMP coming in there this weekend and doing raids and arresting a whole bunch of people. Is that a coincidence? No. The RCMP comes from something called the Northwestern Mounted Police. The Northwestern Mounted Police, as I documented in my book, were specifically created to solve these kinds of land and territory and resource disputes by simply pushing indigenous peoples off of the land that the crown wanted for itself and whatever was under that land and whatever water resources and mineral resources were in the area. The Northwestern Mounted Police, which now is transitioned to the RCMP instead of the NW, they are doing the exact same thing that police force has been doing for generations. That's displacing indigenous people who are like, it's our land. In the same way, local police forces, where did they come from? Did we just evolve naturally to all have these military style police forces in all of our cities now that all look very similar to each other, that all train each other? Was that some natural evolution of history that now unfortunately targets the poor? No. Police were created to protect the property and the rights of white property owning men. And there were things called slave patrols in both Canada and the United States because we both enslaved Black people as governments. And then we said, we got to keep them under control. So what if a Black person just walking around the street trying to be free like Jim is? We can't have that. We need a system so that somebody can go up to that Black person and say, what's your business here? Who do you belong to? Aren't you supposed to be over on that farm somewhere? That is where modern policing comes from. It didn't just target poor people. It targeted enslaved Black people who weren't supposed to be roaming around. And that is why in my work, I talk about the practice of carding, which is when police just go up to people who are minding their own business in public and stop them and start asking them for their information. Do they do that to people because they're poor? No. They target Black people with that behavior, among other groups, because there is a history of being like, when a Black person is roaming around free on these territories, that's suspicious, and it could be a threat to white people and their property. And so the policing system that we inherited today is designed to do things like that. And it is really, really efficient at doing those same things today that it was created to do. Because by the way, guys, people don't just sit in jail or prison when they go there. Many of them are forced to labor. People were making coronavirus masks from jail last year in Canada and distributing them out to members of the public while they were incarcerated. So just like Black people had to labor on the plantation when they weren't free, they were literally trapped and somebody else was dictating their movements and their abilities. That same thing is happening to Black and Indigenous people today in our jails while they make coronavirus masks when some of our jails and prisons had the worst rates of coronavirus anywhere in the country. It's not an accident. Somebody benefits from the police going after the poor. It's not just that, poor people commit more crime. Even what we conceive of as being crime. Like I said, a judge using his power to intimidate people, not a crime. A Black person deciding that they're going to knock off a liquor store to get a few $100, 3, 4, 5, 10 years in jail. What do we even consider a crime? That is dictated by class, by race, and by property ownership and who's entitled to the privileges of this society. So my work focuses a lot on that.
And wealth plays a role.
Absolutely it does. And wealth can insulate you to a great extent, even if you're a person of color, even if you're Black. Having a lot of wealth can insulate you from a lot of these dynamics. It won't insulate you from everyday bigotry, right? So if you're Black and you have a ton of money, you will still face interpersonal discrimination and racism, but you can call the best lawyer in town if you get into trouble, and you can get the same kind of treatment of justice as a rich white person does. That's how the O.J. Simpson trial in the 90s played out. You can pay your way out, and that's why rich white men who commit crimes are not in jail today. That's why our jail system looks the way that it does. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. And I think, Joel, a really critical point, and we could do a whole show on this, but a really critical point that I'll end with here. Maybe we should. But a really critical thing that I think people need to consider is that racism is not about intention. And this is why I think sometimes the analysis people feel like, you're leaning too much to the race side because you're suggesting that there are all these nefarious racist people in our institutions who are trying to hurt Black and Indigenous and other groups of people. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm actually saying that the system is designed to trap those people, no matter who is actually running the institution, no matter who are the foot soldiers in the institution. And I'll end with, appropriately, a story about the Toronto Star and how racism works there when I was working there. Okay. I wrote a piece about this really bad Vice documentary that came out several years ago. Vice did this documentary called This is Dixon. And they went into the Dixon neighborhood in Northwest Toronto, which is a very heavily Somali populated.
Oh, Dixonton. Oh, yeah, Dixonton.
Yeah, we're talking about Dixon. Yeah. Absolutely.
So true.
So shout out to Dixon.
Yeah. I used to work in those areas. Enough to the Somali man I'm out there.
Yeah. So what happened was that the people at Vice decided that Rob Ford was a really big news commodity. And like, hey, Rob Ford seems to be attached to this Dixon Black community. So let's make a documentary where we go into that community in Dixon and we say, is there a gang here? We've heard that there's a gang here. And we're going to do a whole documentary trying to find out whether or not there's a gang connected to Rob Ford in Dixon. And throughout the course of this horrible documentary, they just repeat a whole bunch of stereotypes about Black people and particularly about Somali immigrants to Canada. So I wrote a response to that movie in the Toronto Star, and I used an image from the documentary, one of the only nice images that I saw in there, which was of the two young women laughing and smiling. And I thought, see, this is a side of this community that nobody ever shows, but that is also a part of the community. So I want these two smiling young Black women to be the face of my story that says, you're missing the point here about Dixon. I submitted it. I woke up the next morning. I went online and I look at the feature image of my piece. And there is not the picture that I asked for of the women smiling. There's a picture of a raid happening on Dixon looking for the Rob Ford crack video. And my heart just sank and I was so upset. And I called my editor right away and I was like, what happened to the image that I suggested? And he said, you know, those two women that were in that image, they were kind of younger. And we were worried that without having their permission or their parents' permission, it might not be nice to have their picture.
That's what they were worried about?
That's what they were worried about. Now, I'll tell you something. I was like, okay, like that's a little bit of a strange argument, but fair enough. That's
wasn't
your
that
argument,
image from the other documentary that was already published?
It was from the documentary that I was critiquing, yeah. Okay. But I think the bigger lesson here about how systemic racism works was I asked my editor, okay, so you didn't want to use that image because you didn't have these young women's permission. Okay, why would you use the image of a raid? How come when I'm trying to say that this community is more than just that kind of raid, gangs, guns, why would you completely undercut me by showing the exact same thing about the community over again? And you know what my editor said? I'll never forget it. He said to me, if you go into the Star's database and you type in the word Dixon, this is all you get. All you get are these kinds of pictures of guns and raids and people being thrown to the ground and police presence. And that's because the Toronto Star, over years and years and years, every time they were writing about Dixon, what was happening? Yeah, they were deciding only to go there to respond to a narrative that they were creating. And you know what, Joel? It wasn't one person who went in there and said, haha, I'm going to rig this database so that it only shows negative pictures of Dixon. It's literally the biases of a generation of journalists and their editors only choosing to focus on one aspect of a community so that when they type in the word Dixon, all they see is a particular portrayal of the community, which they unwittingly have created. That's how systemic racism works. It doesn't have to be an individual maliciously sitting behind the keyboard, rigging things against Black people. It can be a cumulative bias, a cumulative ignorance, a cumulative focus on a community that robs them of their humanity and only goes there when it wants to tell a particular story about them. So it's much more than just individual biases and individual intentions. It's about the way our systems and institutions work.
Incredible. Thank you. Thank you, Desmond. This was very insightful. And, of course, we'd love to pick up this conversation another time. Just to respect your time. Thank you for coming on. For the listeners, they want to get in touch with you. How can they get in touch with you?
Well, all my haters will tell you I'm on Twitter because they seem to really not like that. But yes, I do lurk in the Twitter sphere a lot. My handle is just my name. I cannot take responsibility for that. As true as that is, it can be a pretty rough environment out there on Twitter. But I also have used it to engage with a lot of incredible people. So I'm on Twitter. It's just my handle is my name at Desmond Cole. And if anybody wants to follow up about this podcast and have a set of questions or feedback for me, they can email me at heydesmondcole@gmail.com.
And we'll make sure to include all that in the show notes page, make it easy for the audience.
Yeah. And thank you again. Like even that last bit about the police, as Joel and I did an episode on reform the police or defund the police. And so
I listened to that.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. So even like that's a point where we can, probably do this another time and pick up on that conversation and expound on these ideas. Is very, very helpful, very insightful to hear your perspective on these things. And I hope you got an opportunity to get some things off your chest and clarify how you were seeing things. So thank you for coming on and being transparent.
Listen, I'm very grateful to both of you for the opportunity to have a fulsome discussion about all of these things. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being interested. And appreciate both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?
Madden and Mitchell Media.